Kirsty Wark has anchored Newsnight since 1993. She famously clashed with Margaret Thatcher and has interviewed every Prime Minister since. She's probably also interviewed whoever it is that's going to be our Prime Minister next month. She premiered her first novel, The Legacy of Elizabeth Pringle, at the Salon almost exactly 5 years ago, actually. I think it was the Salon before, the Salon after, David. Tonight she returns to take us all to the House by the Loch, which is this really lovely proof that I have here. The House by the Loch, you shouldn't let your American publishers change that to the House by the Lake. I bet they'll try. The novel is set in Galloway, one of the most beautiful but least well-known bits of Scotland. If you're watching the weather forecast, it's the lump to the left where England ends, that big bit. And it's incredibly beautiful. I didn't know it until reasonably recently when I went to the Wigtown Book Festival. It's amazing. There's not very many people there. There is a lot of beauty. Anyway, in the novel, there are 3 generations of a family struggling with grief in the present and a secret from the past. So it draws on historic events like her debut novel and a bit of her personal history. But Jean and Walter and their families aren't real. I had to read it really quickly in the middle to find out what happened, and then I went back and slowed down just to enjoy the view. Please welcome Kirsty Wark. So exciting.
Hi.
Right, look at the cowboy boots. They are kick-arse. So which bit are you going to read for us?
I am going to read a bit which is very important in Walter and Jean are 22 and 21 respectively, and it's a flowering relationship that each has a different expectation of it. And Walter, of course, is incredibly excited by this beautiful young woman who he's met at the PIV, the Pavilion in Ayr. And he brings her down to Loch Doon, which is this incredibly lonely stretch of water 6 miles long on the South Ayrshire-Galloway border. It's a loch that actually holds many secrets and is a scene of, later in the novel, great grief. But at this point, he is wooing her, and he's a young engineer because the Loch Doon is part of the wonderful hydro project which expanded through the southwest of Scotland in the 1930s. So if I just read this little bit, when he comes with her to the loch, brings her to the loch, it's something he's prepared for very well. When they arrived at the dam at the loch, Walter jumped out of the Land Rover and sprinted round to the passenger door to lift Jean down. It amazed him that his hands could encircle her waist, and as she stepped off the running board, he swung her around as lightly as a ballet dancer and set her down on the track. Then he retrieved the bicycles and put the picnic in one front basket and a rug and the champagne in the other. "What a sight," she called out as they pedalled along the loch together. "It's as if the hills have come rolling down to meet us." She sounded her bicycle bell and shouted out, "Hello, hello, is there anyone here?" A startled heron lifted off from a dead tree at the side of the track as if a branch had suddenly come to life and flapped across the loch 50 yards away. "There's your answer," Walter said with a laugh, "and if any of its feathers land on you, it will bring you luck, so pedal fast." They kept pace with each other along the track, and every so often Jean let out a shriek as she bumped over a rut on the rough road, and then she laughed at Walter as he copied her with an exaggerated yell, and they could feel each other's exhilaration and skittishness as keenly if they were cycling through solid air. 5 miles along the shore, they came to the ruins of a 13th century castle sitting in a clearing. "We're here," Walter called out as he braked. "Your castle awaits, my lady." He shook out the rug and opened the picnic basket. Jean dropped to her knees, her legs suddenly shaky from the ride, and held out tin cups while Walter uncorked the champagne with an echoing pop. She took a sip. "Déjeuner sur l'herbe," she said as she offered her mouth for a kiss. "How delicious," murmured Walter. "I've never tasted champagne before, and in a kiss too." They sat against the warm stone, looking at the loch, their shoulders touching, shy suddenly. He told her that for 800 years the castle at their back had stood on a rocky outcrop in the middle of the loch. Imagine, on mornings when the mist was on the water, the castle must have looked as if it was levitating. What I remember is when it really did start to disappear, just before I started school. Walter told Jean that he'd sat day after day, watching as more than 100 stonemasons and labourers, laughing and joking in an Irish brogue that he could hardly understand, took the castle down stone by stone and marked each one with a number. They loaded the huge blocks onto a barge that went back across the 100 yards to the shore to be unloaded on barrows to a makeshift jetty. The men on the island and the men on the jetty used to shout insults at each other through loud hailers. "Come on, you shite hawks. You're slower than a weekend in Bantry." The ashlar blocks were laid out on the ground like a jigsaw and then hoisted up by a giant crane and inched into position by men whose strong hands, as big as shovels, had never before been put to such a strange task and never would again. "Get away, Padraig. You can't count, you idiot. You'll be putting 5 next to 8 and it'll be like the Leaning Tower of Pisa." Walter was captivated by the weather-beaten army who lived in a canvas encampment, dressed in the uniform of flat caps and collarless shirts, who could always find a boiling sweetie for him in their waistcoat pockets when they put their hands in to search for their tobacco. "Maybe that's why I'm so good at numbers. Maybe that's why I like the precision of engineering," he mused. It was like an initiation. He turned to see Jean staring out at the loch. He reddened. "So sorry, I'm boring you." "No, you're not," said Jean quickly and squeezed his arm. "Go on, please." He told her that the castle would have been lost forever if they hadn't moved it for the hydro project. Sometimes at low water you can see the outcrop in the middle of the loch. The castle was held by supporters of the Bruce, and the story goes that years later the portcullis gates were wrenched off by James V's men when they attacked. Now they're buried deep in the loch in a cat's cradle of weeds. "How romantic it all is," Jean said dreamily. Then she raised her hand and pointed at the hills. "The Merrick and the range of the Awful Hand, Mochwacher, Corserine, Cairnsmore of Carsfairn. It sounds like a spell, doesn't it?" Walter opened his eyes wide and stared at her in amazement. She smiled at him, pleased. "I studied the Ordnance Survey map in the library. The names are beautiful, aren't they?" Walter put his hand on her cheek and kissed her. It was enough. He'd planned to tell her more. He wanted her to know that when he was 10, he'd built a cairn on the moor in the memory of a man called František Heckel and visited it still. But now she was enchanted. He did not want her to think of the loch as a place of death. A curlew trilled overhead as she lay back on the rug, drowsy with champagne, and closed her eyes. He looked down at her and stroked her cheek, and then he laid his fedora over her face to keep her from the low autumn sun.
I was just thinking about that from Jean's perspective and him telling these stories and kind of going on and on, and she's saying it's beautiful. And actually, she is a little bit, I think she's a little bit bored, but for her, that's really important, isn't it? Because this is they're both getting involved in a very different marriage, aren't they? They're
getting involved in a very different relationship at first. And in a way, as we find out in the novel, it's a way for Jean to escape her home. And she escapes a home that's a very unhappy, difficult home, and as you talked about earlier, unidentified problems in the family, which then have a massive impact on her going forward, particularly her relationship with her mother. Her father less so, he's more of a peripheral character. But she has to escape, and she sees Walter as he stands with his back to her in the pavilion.
His tweedy back.
With his tweed back, with his new tweed suit that he's just picked up. And in this, she sees her escape. And he's a simple soul. She is a very clever young woman who has been, in a sense, thwarted. Her father wanted her not even to work, actually. And she goes in and works in a library. And that is a huge outlet for her, her creativity.
Yeah. Yeah, so she sees him as an anchor.
Yes,
really,
completely.
And that he's going to stabilise her.
Yeah, and he adores her too much from the start.
Yeah, no, he can see none of her potential faults.
Yes.
Well, not faults, but
flaws, and
yeah.
and they quickly become apparent.
Yeah.
And then in the book, there's kind of Walter is the central character, Jean, his wife, and his granddaughter Carson. We'll come on to talk about grandparent relationships in your book. And in a way, what I'm sort of saying, hoping to say with the book, if you're trying to say anything, is that families can be very easily unmade through no faults of their own, but then can be made in a different way again. And I wanted to explore that kind of intergenerational way, how things move and become apparent. And then in this book, there are a lot of secrets, which, in a way, I suppose, like Elizabeth Pringle, unfold towards the latter third of the book.
Yeah, I mean, you fairly gallop through the last bit of it, and I didn't actually see it coming, which I thought, well, good for her. But I really didn't, and I went back, and then I could see the points where you'd sort of sown the seed, but I didn't know what the secret would be from the past that was kind of going to affect the present. But I want to talk a bit more about Jean as a character, because she's really, really attractive.
Yes,
and
she is, and she looks very attractive. Lisa Heighton's made her look particularly attractive.
Yes, she has. She's looking lovely on the cover. But she's a feminist at a time when people wouldn't use that word. And she's a librarian in Ayr, and she starts the first section in the library for women writers.
Yes, she does. And of course, there are, and her mother is called Edith, and her mother's kind of very interested in Edith Wharton and collects Edith Wharton memorabilia. And so that's a way of Jean sort of at a very young age showing great promise in the library by digging out old Edith Wharton books. I like that idea that she has this hinterland, and she also has a hinterland in a way like David's characters with the stage, and that then is passed on to two generations hence as well.
But what I think is really interesting about the stage is with Jean is that as opposed to David's Charlie, where it's like excruciating and he's, as all teenagers are doing, they're trying on different identities. It's only when Jean is on a stage that you actually get any sense that she's stable or that she's being herself.
Yes, and I think that's right, because in fact she's having to, I think, in a way, because her family is so damaged, play a part of herself, try and work out who she is, and she's too young to do that, and she doesn't really have the tools. So through Amdram, and Ayr had the Airfort Players, which is one of the very first Amdrams in Scotland. She is transformed, and again, another layer of captivation by Walter when he sees her on stage. And he is, he's a young man. He's lived in Loch Doon all his life. He's learned to be an engineer. He's worked in this fantastic, modernist, beautiful hydro stations. But he's not a cultured man.
No.
And he's a very clever man, but he has never been allowed to see that side of him flourish. And in fact, in a sense, what happens 2 generations later, he helps his granddaughter to flourish in that way.
Yeah, yes, I think both the gift of that performativity and also the curse of whatever it is. I mean, you never really name the illness. I mean,
I don't.
Jean's mother, Edith, never leaves the house that she lives in. It's a very beautiful
my son
house.
calls her a shut-in.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what, that's indeed what happened. There are other people I know that were like that.
There were other people.
Well, great aunts and things like that. I knew people that were very reclusive. So I'm drawing on that, but it's not them.
No. Can I just go back to that for a second? So what would you go to see them as a girl?
Yeah, I would go and see a great aunt who very rarely left the house. I mean, she wasn't entirely a shut-in, but she very rarely left. But there are particular reasons for Edith's not leaving, which are different kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
And the pull for Jean very much is to have this relationship with Walter that lets her escape. But what she's escaping to is a very remote loch.
Yeah.
Where Walter is utterly anchored and cannot leave, and I think that's a kind of recurring trope.
Yeah.
He can't leave, and in a way, his not being able to leave is part of the destruction.
Why can't he leave? I mean, he could, because he gets a job offer. He could go somewhere else, but he feels bound to this loch, and I think it's because of what happened at the start. But
at the start, and it was only when I was researching the book that I realised, and I'll say it because it's right and it's on the first page. When I was researching this book, I had no idea that in Loch Doon there was a Czech pilot from the Second World War and a Spitfire. And what happened when the Free Czechs managed to get through France and came to join the Air Force, they had their own squadron, and the squadron trained out of Ayr.
Oh, right.
The air base at Ayr. And so Walter was aware of these Spitfires kind of flying around. I mean, they still use that area for low flying. And this day when he's little and he's out in the loch and he's on his own and he hears that low drone from the distance, and we don't know immediately what it is, but what happens is suddenly the Spitfire comes into view. And nobody knows exactly what happened, but they think what happened was that because Loch Doon is in fact a reservoir now, and was a reservoir from the late 1930s, that the bailiff might have raised the water level.
Oh, so he was
So
fine.
early morning, the Czech, Francis Heckel, who was retraining in Spitfires, because I'd read that he was in a much bigger planes before he came over, and they all trained out of air in Spitfires, and he came down over the water very, very low, and he just tipped his wing, and he never came out. And as a little boy, Walter saw this go down. And he didn't think it was his fault in a way, but he felt it was something that only he had witnessed and could bear witness to. And I think that was really one of the reasons he stayed. And the other thing was cowardice.
He carries it.
He carries that, and he carries that through the book. And he doesn't want to tell Jean about it because he doesn't want to terrify her that there's something dead in the loch.
And then you said in cowardice as well?
Yeah, because in cowardice, because it's what he knows. I don't think he would want to go away. He also knows that if he marries Jean, she has to be near her mother.
Right.
And so this push-pull, whether they should go, if he goes to Ayr, he's further away from his work. He doesn't want her to work. Young middle-class women in the 50s, especially when they're pregnant, after they're pregnant, didn't work very often. And so he's torn. So they make their life in the loch, and then Jean wants to stay in the loch as a way of getting away from her home in Ayr.
Yeah, but her world gets smaller and smaller because she's not allowed to work, and then she starts to drink.
He would let her work, but she didn't. She was, and then what is revealed in the book is that she is starting to drink, and in a very sad way, it unravels their marriage, and he has no way of dealing with it. He hasn't the tools to deal with it. She can't admit to it, and it brings the most terrible calamity on the family. And that's a later calamity, and then an earlier calamity, and then in the next generation there's another calamity.
It keeps going because it's not discussed, it's not talked about.
It's not discussed. And in many ways, and it's quite interesting because mental health is completely Scottish, but also mental health issues of many, because are even, funnily enough, I just did start the week this morning about the whole idea of mental health with the wonderful poet George Surtees, and mental health issues were rarely discussed. Really discussed. My great aunt is a kind of recurring theme, because she didn't form the character of Elizabeth Pringle at all, but the great aunt that really left the house, she was one of the first people in Scotland to undergo electroshock treatment. When she was a young woman, she was VAD in the First World War, and she came back and she didn't work. She kind of looked after the family house and everybody in it. And it was never discussed, really. She did at least have treatment, but it was never discussed. But Jean's...
Did the treatment work?
I don't think it did, actually.
No.
I don't think it did. She was always on her own, and I think she had a beau, and he went away to New Zealand, and she kept saying she was going to go. And one of my elderly uncles said there used to be, every so often, a telegram would come in, and there was great Aunt Bertie was going away, then she wasn't going away, then she was going to New Zealand, then she wasn't, and she was deeply fragile. So to me, they love each other, and they're amazingly romantic together at times, but at other times it crashes and burns.
Let's talk about Galloway, because I think really very few people have kind of gone there. It's where you drive past it, don't you, when you go up the border? You'd have to make a conscious decision to go. Well, you go from
if you're going down to Galloway Forest Park, you go down from Ayr, and there'll be a map in the book. You go down from Ayr through to Castle Douglas and onto Dumfries. And the first 3 years of my life I spent in Castle Douglas. I know that area very well because my father fished there his whole life, because his first job after the war as a lawyer was in Castle Douglas. So I knew that area, and I knew how remote it was. And I always loved it. And
what did you love about it?
I loved the bleakness of it in a way, but I also love the Galloway Hills, and I love the climate, which is and there's great Covenanting history there. There's more Covenanting history in the book, but Lisa quite rightly said less of the history. So it was an area that I wanted to celebrate because it is so little known, and also because there's a wonderful, who many of you I'm sure will know, sculptor called Andy Galsworthy, who has in Money Ive put his first, what was the Striding Arch, and the Striding Arch is all about emigration, who stays and who goes. And these Striding Arches are beautiful, perfect sandstone arches, and the first one comes out of an old cow byre at a place that was called Conrate, which was cleared. People went from there, probably to Canada. And half of the arch is inside the byre, and half of it strides out, and then there's two more in the hills. And then these Striding Arches are in upstate New York, they're in Canada, and they're in New Zealand.
So the place he's people left and
there
the
are places people
went.
left and people, and my point is that Walter stays. And in many ways, as a young engineer, you know, with the training he got in the hydro, he could have gone north, he could have gone abroad. But he is anchored very much the same way as half the Striding Arch is anchored.
Now, some people do have to leave. They feel compelled to go. And you portray something that I thought was, I mean, it was very personal and relevant to me. And I had never read it before, where you know, this lesbian character is forced kind of to leave Scotland in the, you know, the 80s, because she can't be herself. She'll just be the lezzy. She'll just be the lezzy or the lezzy auntie. So she goes to New York. She becomes one of those people who leaves.
She leaves, and she is much the happier for it.
Yeah, of course.
But she's leaving her twin sister behind, and you know, this actually is, as you say, it's really the late 70s. You know, when discrimination was awful. You know, I can remember at my school, you know, girls, there was any hint, they were called names, they were shunned, there was twittering, there was whispering and so forth. And, you know, this young woman is enormously talented and then goes on to work in a place that I absolutely adore, so I wanted to put her there, which is the Morgan Library in New York. Where she has a really wonderfully fulfilled life, but there's a resentment again about her sister because she misses her, but you know, they can't afford to go. She's poorly paid in New York, and as we know, Americans get few holidays. So there's a push-pull of that as well. Yeah,
but America has been a really important place in your life and in the life of your family as well. You give to one of the characters sort of the experience that your son has had of going to university there and becoming an actor and becoming, you know, himself in a way. And I think that, and I love the fact my daughter's here too, and she went for a year as well. And I think that idea, and I see young people doing it now much more than we would have had a chance to do, well, certainly when I was growing up, of going. It's closer now. It seems closer. You can have that other experience, and our lives are enriched by it. And she was allowed to be herself and blossom there in a way that she would never have done in Ayr in that period. You know, even later than that, you know, a friend of mine who's gay didn't come out for so long. Because of the opprobrium from his small town in Scotland. And we mustn't ever hide from that, you know. No. Prejudice is a hellish thing. But...
yes, no shit, Sherlock.
You do, one of the miraculous things that you do in the book is that you make Ayr seem glamorous.
It was!
Which will be...
It was.
No, but I was like, it was so... There's the pavilion, they're dancing, there's the library, there's a tea room, there's
there's a wonderful little Italian restaurant, which was the first Italian restaurant in Ayr.
Right, okay. The first Italian restaurant in Ayr, I love that.
And because you've got to remember, that was the other brilliant thing. I mean, you know, and it happens with Von Vona and Crolla in Edinburgh. And also, you know, people, you know, Paolo Nutini's family, lots of famous Italian Scots came here, and then Lina Zavaroni had to be interred in the Second World War, or some of them came pre-Second World War. And there's this wonderfully vibrant Italian-Scottish community. And some of it is actually in Ayr. You know, I went to school with Italian-Scottish girls when I was at school in Ayr, and it's a tremendous...
How did you conjure it to me? Because it isn't glamorous now. I mean, when I went on school trips there, I mean, it's like, I'm from the Bronx and I was going to sub-Bronx. I mean, we didn't want to get off the bus when we got to Ayr. No, the beach was nice. I mean, in a kind of very frigid, cold way. But what I did get as a sense as a child, though, was that it was ruined because it had been glamorous. There were these big sandstone buildings.
Oh yes, I mean, beautiful. I mean, one of these wonderful railway hotels, which are throughout the UK. But particularly, there was a lovely one which is now a complete disaster. There was this fantastic Art Deco cinema. At one point I was going to have them go to the Art Deco cinema in Castle Douglas, which actually has lovers' double seats, and few cinemas have that. But that was a really big thing in Ayr, was to have that fabulous, you know, and people went to the movies all the time.
That's fascinating.
And it was a real thing, and it was very glamorous, and velvet seats and all that kind of stuff. And so Ayr was a very, very prosperous place.
So what did for it?
What did for it was the end of it. It went to a lot of industry. What it did for it as well was people going abroad on holiday. You know, Edwardians went all along that coast. These were brilliant places to go for holidays. As you said, the beach is fantastic.
Cold, but fantastic.
Yes. But Ayr's also a place, and also it's got fantastic things like, you know, I mean, it's got one of the oldest wine cellars, you probably know. That's it, Corney and Barrow, Wiggham's. And there are lots of places to go to.
And it's got a lovely Carnegie Library. It's
got a brilliant library, and that is one of the most beautiful Carnegie libraries. And it was very important to me that I put Jean there, partly as a kind of clarion call, because I adore libraries, and what's happening to libraries is awful. I mean, remaking them is brilliant, closing them is hellish.
Yes,
and I was lucky enough to grow up in Kilmarnock, again, a town that's, it was a country industrial town, at which a lot of it's, really ruined now, which had the Dick Institute, which was just the best place to go as a child. You went, you get books out, 3 books, took them back, 2 weeks later, always had fantastic books, always wonderful place to go.
Yeah, well, it's worked its magic on you, and your second novel is brilliant. So thank you for premiering it here tonight. Thank you, Kirsty Wark. We'll be back after the interval.